All right, so we're going to talk about the, oops, wrong button here. We're going to talk about the uh, Messenger project today. So if you recall, that is the thing that looked like this. Um, I I believe I put this in Canvas. I believe I put the zip file in Canvas. I was working late last night, so I could have imagined all of that. So um, uh, you don't need to follow along with any of this. I am going to do a separate walkthrough of the actual like step by step installation. Although I think you can kind of guess what to do at this point. Um, but I will step through it just in case anything gets kind of missed in translation on this. Okay, so just a quick recap of what we're doing here. We have two regular web apps, HTML, CSS, JavaScript. We can imagine these as two web browsers, Firefox on the left, Safari on the right, or two separate computers altogether. And they're communicating via web API calls using JSON, and they're being translated. These little arrows, you can envision these being PHP programs that we're using, and they're communicating with a MySQL database on the server. And that's where our messages are stored, and we're storing those things in database tables that look somewhat like these, and the messages go both ways. So we can send, we can receive, and so on and so forth. So keep that in mind. I'll maybe refer back to this in just a little bit. So let's look at the actual program now. I'm going to actually wipe it out. Okay. So when you install this clean, this is what it looks like. Okay, so we just have a little box. We have a sender, a recipient, and we have a little toggle button that toggles the sender and the recipient back and forth. I have some default values in here. I have Elliot and Gina, and you hit connect, and it will add these users if they're missing to the database and allow you to send as the sender and send to the recipient. Okay, so I'll connect on this one. When you connect it, it plays a little sound. I don't think you'll hear that on the recording or in your on the call, but it plays a little sound there. And then you get a little message box that you can type into, and I can type hello, and then it'll pop up a message. And you should have kind of a good idea as to how this would work as of right now, right? We entered information into a form, it popped up here. Okay. And here I use the enter key as a listener, but you can also hit the send button, and those work the same way. Okay, so I can do either one interchangeably, but I did hit the enter key there, and it hit and sent the message here. We could do all of those things without the server involved if we're just sending it to ourselves here. Okay. However, we did send it to the server, and it appeared up here as server data. So it sent it to the server, and then it pulled it back from the server. So this is actually information that it gathered from the server. Okay. And we're going to pull this up now on a totally different browser. So we don't have anything cached or anything. So we have Safari over here. So normally I use Chrome for debugging purposes. We're going to use Firefox and Safari. Okay, and the reason I have this little toggle button is to make it easy for demoing this stuff. So now I'm going to make the sender as Gina. So on this side, Gina's kind of logged in. On this side, Elliot is logged in, and I'm going to hit connect. And you'll notice that the messages show up in blue over here. Okay, so we just kind of have a differentiation there. And now when I send a message, Okay, we'll send a little message. So now when I send it, um, it the JavaScript knows this is a new message that came in while the page was open from somebody else, not from itself, and so it dims the screen and shows a little alert here. Not a regular JavaScript alert, but a custom alert that we did, in uh, as our own HTML. Okay, so we'll close that and do the same thing going here. Okay, and it goes over there. And there's a little sound that plays for that. On Chrome, if you want the sound to play for alerts, you have to actually allow that. But these other browsers, I think, as long as the sound plays on the first one, then it plays on the subsequent ones, and it's not a problem. But Chrome, I think, is a little pickier. It doesn't like sounds playing without people interacting. So, any questions about any of that so far? Pretty interesting, cool stuff. Lame, boring, stupid, too early, too late. Nothing. Okay, good. I mean, for a first semester class, right? Not too bad, right? I think this is a pretty good thing to do in a first semester class. And I think you'll understand most of the components. So, most of this stuff I think you should already understand based on the things we've done already. So, just looking at this, you may already suspect this is Bootstrap that we're using. We have a 2-column layout. So we have this stuff over here on the left is one column. This stuff on the right, the messages, is another column, and then there's some Bootstrap columns within the columns over here, and I think these are Bootstrap columns within the columns over here as well. So we're just using a Bootstrap layout to lay things out. Bootstrap buttons, the alert. So we're just using Bootstrap for that stuff. So that's relatively simple. So let's jump into the code. Lots of code this time around. Most of it is stuff we've seen from the HTML, CSS, JavaScript land, but there's some new PHP code and there's some MySQL code, so totally new languages. But I think what you're going to notice is these things are going to feel familiar. So, but stop me if you have questions. So we're going to start with the HTML like usual. I'm going to go pretty quick. So, like I said, this is running Bootstrap. Font awesome for I think there's just the one icon that I have in there, but it allows you to use that for your own stuff if you want to. It is container fluid, so you can resize it. So let's see what of note in here. So it's just Bootstrap. If you have questions about Bootstrap, let me know, but I'm going to just kind of gloss over that otherwise. One thing of note, I do have the audio inline in the HTML. So I'm not adding the audio into the JavaScript like we did with the space game. I do have it inline here. And I did that because I think either Firefox or Safari, if it's in the HTML, in one of the cases, I think that allowed for one of the sounds to play versus when having it directly in the JavaScript. Sound playing in JavaScript is just kind of a mess right now, so that may not even be true a year from now. So, but at any rate, I try to keep it close to the thing that the sound was being used for, so it kind of actually makes sense to put it there. So for the submit button, the connect button, I should probably, if it's going to be submit, I should call it submit instead of connect. I got to get consistent with my naming, right? But anyway, this stuff is all one area. And then same thing down here for the alert. I have the receive message. So let's just break this down just real quickly. So everything's in the container fluid except for There's an overlay to dim the screen, and then on top of that, there's that alert message with a close button on it. Okay. So then inside the container fluid, we have the row, of course. And then we have two columns: the user info, the message output. Inside the user info, we have two forms: the server info form and the send message form. Inside the message output, we have nothing because that gets dynamically created. So that stuff all gets created in the JavaScript. Okay. So relatively straightforward. Okay. HTML should be nothing super surprising in there. Just divs with IDs and some classes. There's a hidden class here because it's not showing by default. Nothing that should be super surprising if you understood what we did so far. So we'll jump into the CSS. Again, nothing should be super surprising here either. Most of this stuff is just styling stuff. So I put a little margin on the forms just to add some spacing. Hidden just is display none. So if something has a class of hidden, it means display none. So the alert isn't displayed by default. We get rid of that when we display it. Dim, when dim is visible. So dim, if you recall, is hidden by default because it has that class of hidden. But when the dim div is visible, it's black, but it has opacity of 0.5, so it looks gray, and it kind of halfway hides what's behind it. And then the other stuff is just boxes with shadows and borders and colors. I don't think there's anything else weird. Just using Times New Roman for the font. You could certainly pick something cooler. Let's see. I think there's nothing else really cool here. I even made these just the words blue and gray because I'm anticipating you're going to change those. So try to make those really simple. Okay. So that's the CSS. Nothing of any interest really there. And the JavaScript is actually going to be relatively simple as well. Shouldn't be too much surprising there either if you kind of follow the stuff we've been doing before. So we have our by ID that we used before. We used show and hide before, and that just adds and removes the hidden class. I do have a new helper function to convert a timestamp. So if we go and we look at our kind of our diagram of the project, we have a time field in our message table. These are called tables in SQL. So in our message table, we have a timestamp. And in SQL, the timestamp is going to be a long integer. So it's just going to be a numeric. It's not going to be a formatted date like a human would read. It's just going to be a big long number. And that allows us to compare it really easily. Okay, so it's easier to work with for computers, but it's harder for humans to work with. So this convert timestamp does that conversion. Okay, so we convert the timestamp to something that a human can read, which is something more like this down below. Okay, so that's it. Then most everything else is in the chat object generating function. So we have a new chat. We have a couple constants, the return key, the escape key. I actually could have put these right into chat. Probably should have done that. It's kind of weird that I didn't. I probably should change the code. I do have one little bug in the code somewhere that I have to get to the bottom of, by the way. So there might be a small update. However, since you guys are going to customize things anyway, it may not impact what you're doing. So there may be a fix or not. So just be a heads up on that. So anyway, we call chat. We call an initialization function inside of chat. And then here's set interval again. And every 2 seconds, 2000 milliseconds, we call the get messages function inside of chat. And so every 2 seconds, it checks for new messages. That's it. That's how it works. Okay. So inside of chat, we have some listeners that listen for, if we send a new message or if we, do some other things. But mostly listening to see if we send a new message, then it sends the message. Otherwise, we're just getting messages every 2 seconds. Okay. So inside of chat, let's break this down a little bit. Have some, these are our properties that we're kind of dealing with in here. Here's our init, just setting some things up. So one thing that is of note is we need to figure out the time zone offset. So your browser, your web browser has a time zone, and that is going to be different than the universal time code that is placed in your database. So there is a universal time that is based in London, England. Used to be called GMT. Now it's called UTC for Universal Time Code, I think. Used to stand for Greenwich Mean Time. But anyway, so we are in the central time zone in the U.S. We're generally -6. Anyway, they're 6 hours ahead of us. So at 9:49 a.m., it's 3:43 or 3:49 p.m. there. So they're 6 hours ahead of us. So we're -6. Depends which way you're looking, I guess. So anyway, we get that offset, okay, and so we need to know what that offset is so we can print the actual time in our time zone for the user. So we need to know that. All right, then logged in is called when we hit the connect button. So we call a sound, we grab the values, we clear out the message output on the right side of the screen. We set the newest message value to 0. So every message has a value, and that's this ID field. That's a numeric value that... My screen is blank? Wasn't blank the whole time, was it? Let me just... I'll reshare it. Thanks for mentioning that. Okay. All right. So anyway, so every single... Could just take time to update too, because I'm moving things around, and I probably shouldn't do that so much. But thanks for mentioning that. So the ID, every single message has a unique number, and we use that to differentiate the items in the database table. So if you think about these database tables as being spreadsheets, think about these as being rows in the spreadsheet. You could think about these as being just numbered 1 through, as many messages as we have. So the first one could be 1. It could also be 100. Doesn't matter. It's arbitrary. It just has to be a unique number. Okay. So at any rate, they're going to be not 0. And so we set the newest message to 0 because the message is never going to be 0. So that way that when we get a new message, it's always going to be higher than that. Okay. So that's our comparison. So that's the point of that. And then we show the send message form. So if you recall, when we first go to the page, the send message form is hidden. So when we hit connect, it shows this message form. Okay. And then it puts focus into here. So if you see the cursor's blinking in the enter message here box. Okay. So that's what this does. The get messages is that thing that runs every 2 seconds. So this does a lot of work. So I'm going to circle back on this. So I'm going to just collapse this for now. Send a message. I think I'm going to circle back on this too. So the other simple things are switch users. That just swaps the two boxes. So this is how you do that sort of thing. You just read the two values in and swap them around. This key handler function, I don't know if this is the best way to do this. I was handling everything in one function here. I don't know that that's necessarily how I would do that if I was doing it over, but anyway, I'm reading in the key code, the event, and pulling out the key codes and figuring out if it's the sender or the recipient, and doing the appropriate thing for the enter key and the escape key. So I'm using the key handler for all these items here. Okay, so that's really the end here. So if I have the return key and the escape key, I'm doing these various things. So I can hit the escape key to swap the users. So everything can be keyboard handled instead of having to click around. That's kind of the idea here. So these are all of our listeners. And again, it's a little weird to put all the listeners in here and put some of this stuff out of here. Probably sloppy coding. I probably should have put everything in or some of these things out to keep things consistent. But it is what it is. Feel free to clean that up. All right. So any questions so far? Anything strike you as weird? I'm going to dig into the send messages now. Send message. Still good. How come those guys yesterday had a bunch of questions? You guys don't ever have questions. Are you smart or are you liars? Or are you sleeping? Both. I believe that. I totally believe that, Annie. Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. It's weird because it's like almost everybody in the class versus everybody in here, and we have roughly like the same number of people, I think, that end up showing up. It's like everybody asks questions over there, nobody asks questions over here. Kind of weird. Kind of weird. All right. So, send message. So this is where we start integrating in with another programming language. How awesome is that? First semester programming for maybe none of you guys, but for some of the people in this class, first semester programming, and we get to integrate in another language. That is so awesome. Yep. Even if it's PHP, which has sort of an unfair bad reputation. So we are going to ultimately send our message to the sendmessage.php program. Okay, and we will look at that in a little bit. So just like before, we grab our values. Then we clear out the value. So here we're grabbing the text, and then we blank it out on the screen because we don't need it anymore on the screen because we sucked it out. Here I'm doing a little bit of sanitization of the input. Not enough. Whenever you're dealing with a database or sending anything to a server, you should be super, super careful with the input that you gather from a user, because you should never trust input from a user. You should act like it's always, just like if you were doing delivery, you should never trust what's in the package, right? You should assume that every package is a bomb. You should assume that everybody has the virus, like we're told now, right? You should assume that all data that you're receiving is contaminated. So that's what this is a little bit. So if there's quotation marks, for instance, we are replacing them with the HTML entity version of a quotation mark. And the reason for that is these will do nothing if there's an attempt to interpret those in MySQL. So what oftentimes happens is something called an SQL injection attack, and we're not safeguarding against all opportunities for that. I'm sure that this code is insecure. Writing some straightforward, simple code sometimes makes it hard to be secure. So there probably is some insecurity in here somewhere. But just doing some simple things like swapping the quotes out like this. If we didn't do this, someone could escape out the quotation marks and send an additional query to the database that would allow them to extract data from the database. So what happens oftentimes is someone will be using a login form, and they know that the database will be queried for a single user, and then they'll just add an additional query because they know how SQL works, and they'll ask for all of the usernames and passwords on the system. And so when you hear about breaches where all the usernames and passwords on a system, even if they're encrypted, they'll get the encrypted versions of a password because they're not stored in plain text, and that's what you'd get. But you still have them. You have the encrypted passwords that you could offline try to hack. You could do that sort of thing. So that's kind of how you'd build those attacks. So anyway, that's what these lines are about. And then here, this is where we're building the data that we're going to send over to the server. Okay. So this is the object. So we're just building a little object, a JavaScript object of the message sender, which is a string. So it's a name. In this case, Elliot's the sender, Gina's the recipient, and then the message text gets sent. Okay, those are just three strings. Okay, and don't get confused by this, but in different contexts, we're going to be talking about the sender and the recipient as numbers by their ID numbers, and sometimes by the string, by the text name. So the computer cares about the number, the humans care about the name. So we have to do that translation too at some points. Okay, but here, because we're using the API, the JavaScript can just care about the name. The JavaScript doesn't even have to know that there is a number behind this in this case. Okay, so then just like we did before, we can convert our message into JSON, a JSON string, and we're going to create an HTTP request, so an AJAX request, and we're going to open a post connection. So a post connection is simply we're going to send data without attaching it to the URL. Okay, so like when you do a Google search, I think I maybe mentioned this before. When you are doing a Google search, your data gets added to the your search data gets added to the URL. Okay, and that's a feature. That's not a security thing that they're breaching, because if you wanted to save this search for later and add this to your address bar, to your bookmarks, you could just save that and you can come back to it later. Okay, that's a feature, and that's because these parameters are added to the URL. Okay, in this case, we're not doing that because there's a username password situation. Or there's a secret message situation. So in these sorts of situations, we don't want to do that. Okay. So, all right. All right. So then that is it for send message. Okay. Any questions about that? The whole idea here is this is how we would tackle sending something to an API. Okay, we're going to just build our stuff into JSON. Okay, and then just send it over. In this case, we can send it post. So if there's a JSON API, we can communicate with it by JavaScript and just send it there. Okay, so that is how we would attack that. So that's send message. And then get messages. Um, and yeah, they're named a little differently because get messages, there will be conceivably multiple messages at a time that are being retrieved. So get messages, because of that, there's a little different, a little more complexity potentially. Um, so again, we're calling the get messages.php on the server. I have some helper functions for building the HTML. Okay, so that's what these are really doing. So I won't delve into those too much. Uh, Same thing with this, the close alert. I think those are probably relatively self-explanatory. And then I have a parse messages helper inside of here. And let's see, is there anything in parse messages I need to call out? So parse messages takes the message object and breaks it down and runs the loop, and then calls these build messages on each of these. So I think other than just recognizing that there's a loop, and then splitting it out versus if it's what does parse mean? Excellent question. So we talked about regular expressions before. Think of parsing as, in vague terms, applying regular expressions. So if you speak English, you're parsing an English sentence into nouns and verbs. You're following rules. So we're parsing the message data by following a set of rules, and we're splitting it apart. So we have our set of messages. It's being sent over as JSON data, as an array of objects, and we have to know what that is. We have to know what kind of data we're getting, and we split that apart. Which is, thank you for asking that question, because that brings a different class of security issues that can happen, and you should never trust that the server you're talking to is going to give you good data either. That can give you another class of man-in-the-middle attacks, those are called, where somebody could give you bad data that way. That could give you a security problem. So we should be sanitizing the information we even get from the server, making sure that that's not bad. Not really doing that. I'm trusting that the server is good. So what do I mean by that? Well, it could be sending messages that are too big. It could be sending messages that aren't following their proper rules, that could try to crash our program. Okay. So, but I'm not really testing that. So parsing is actually a huge issue. And when we hear about security exploits, when you hear about terms like memory leaks or buffer overflows, it has to do with parsing gone wrong. So anyway, so that's parse message is where I end up calling the convert timestamp, printing the time. So this is where the messages kind of get built. Okay, and I'm calling the display alert for the newest message if there's a new message from the message recipient. So if I'm communicating with another user and a message comes in from that user, it gives me an alert. Okay, and something with having to do with not this code in specific, because I think this is actually pretty simple, but something to do with this in conjunction with the other stuff. There's some kind of bug there, so I got to get to the bottom of that. All right, so then how we get these messages. So this is where we actually enter the get messages function. So this is where things kind of start. Okay, so if there's a message sender and a message recipient, okay, so we're checking our own program to make sure that these things exist. Otherwise, don't even bother with this stuff. So if there's a message sender and a message recipient, then let connection string equal connection URL. So we're gonna start building a connection string, and this is called a get type of connection. So that's what I was demonstrating with the Google string before. So there's get and there's post. Get is the one with the question mark and the ampersands in the URL. So we're going to construct that with the messages. Okay. And then we're just going to do the same kind of thing. We're going to open a get request here and get the messages, and then we're going to call parse messages on that. And then it does all the other stuff and loops through that all. And I wanted to clean this up so that this didn't get unruly. I wanted to kind of keep this nice and concise, so that's why I broke it all out up above. Okay. And I had to have a listener added so that we could have a close button on that, the dialog window that kind of opens up for the alert. So that's what this is about. That's the only kind of straggler there. So that is our JavaScript. I went through that kind of fast, kind of intentionally fast. Any questions on anything there that I did gloss over things? Sort of intentionally. So anything on any of that. I do want to dig into the PHP and the SQL just a little bit. So, but if anything stands out to you, I do want to address it. Nobody? Guys are too smart, or you're a bunch of dirty liars. Thank you for the question on parse. Huge question. All right. So now let's talk about the send message.php. Okay. So we're, again, if I go back to our code and we are on the page here, I hit connect and I type a message here and I hit send. This, when I hit enter here, it sends to the server. Okay. This is what we're going to talk about here. So the send message.php. Now this is, we're going to end up with some dependencies to simplify our code. Okay. So, dependencies we can think of as additional code that we're bringing in from it is additional code we're bringing in from another file. Okay. So I'm bringing in code from another file called messenger.php. So in my send message.php, which is the program that gets executed by when we call it from the browser, and we execute PHP programs, by the way, just by calling their URL in the web browser. So when we call a PHP program, the web browser goes, oh, this is a program. I'm going to run it, and I'm going to display the output of that program instead of just showing the giving the JavaScript to the web browser to execute, or giving the HTML to the web browser to execute. It actually executes all this code on the server and gives the results to the web browser. So all this code is executed on the server. The web browser doesn't see any of this stuff, okay, except the output. Okay, so the very first line I was addressing there, this require once. So this is what's called a dependency. This program is dependent on messenger.php. So I'm going to be using some functions in here that are defined in messenger.php. So that's one thing. And but the messages are being archived, and maybe touch on the difference of storing versus not storing this type of data. Great question. So we are storing the messages. They're stored in an SQL database. They're not encrypted. This is a super insecure way of doing messaging. If you were actually doing this as a commercial product, there's a number of security things you do on top of this to, make sure that agencies of different governments wouldn't have access to this data, that hackers wouldn't be able to hack it, all that kind of stuff. But it is archived until you delete it. Now, knowing that, you could provide as one of your program's features, you could allow users to delete the data. Snapchat style, or you could automatically delete them or whatever. Okay. So versus not storing this type of data. So in any fashion, in order to get the data from one place to the other, it needs to be stored for a little bit because if you think about a text message, okay, if your phone is off, what happens to that text message? Do you just never get it? Does the sender get an error message? So then you have to deal with all those issues. Okay, so you either need to store it or you need to be able to check that the user exists. But at any rate, the server needs to hold on to that data for some amount of time in order for it to check. So it is storing it in some fashion, no matter what. For a non-zero amount of time, it is going to have access to that data. So, so there is no such thing as like a system that doesn't have the data at all. Now, it might be encrypted the entire time, but whether you're using Facebook or Apple Messages or anything, you have to trust the system you're going through. So hopefully that answers that a little bit. All right, so excellent question. So back to PHP. Couple things of note. It's more similar than different, PHP and JavaScript. Even though it might visually look really different, you're going to find that it's more similar than different. The very obvious difference is the files in .php instead of .js. That's an easy one. All the JavaScript files end. They have to start and end with a tag, and that's because PHP can actually be embedded into a web page just like JavaScript can be. And we put that into a tag just like JavaScript can go into a script tag. PHP can go into a PHP tag. So we embed it all into one tag, just like an image tag or a P tag or an H1 tag. We put this into like a pseudo tag here that gets interpreted by the web browser. And the web browser comes across this. It comes across a PHP file. It says, okay, there might be PHP code we have to look at. And then it looks for this tag. And then it says, aha, here's some PHP code. And then it interprets this. And it finds out if there's any output. And it outputs it. And then it hands that back to the web browser. Okay. So inside this is a tag. And, ultimately it ends up being kind of like a virtual tag in the HTML. So bracket, question mark, PHP, and then at the bottom, question mark, close bracket. Okay, so all PHP programs are going to have an open and close bracket like that. And like I said, this one happens to have a dependency, so we're using this require once function that's built into PHP. One thing that people do not like about PHP, it's a love-hate thing. PHP has sort of a function for everything, has a huge function library of built-in functions, but it's got a whole bunch of kind of inconsistent names, and they're like long names like file get contents. This is a built-in function. I didn't write this as a built-in function, and so it's hard to learn and memorize all those. But there's also excellent documentation for PHP on the php.net website. So it's fine. It's just different. And then it follows the same syntax. This is a function. This could just be a JavaScript function. They're built really the same way. So we're sending a string here, okay, to this function, and then it's doing some stuff. Ends with a semicolon. So this is just a function call. This is a line just like JavaScript. This is a line just like JavaScript, except for the fact that we have a $sign here. Okay, so variables have a $sign, and in this case, this is an associative array, and so we have this is a kind of a different thing. So here we have like a global variable situation that we're talking about, but all variables start with a $sign in PHP to signify they're not functions. Because much like JavaScript, variables and functions are sort of the same thing. But in this case, we signify variables as being kind of their own thing with a $sign. So here, $sign raw message data equals the function call, and we get the output of that. Okay. So then, other than that, the string concatenate operator is a dot instead of a plus, which is kind of nice because it differentiates those things. So you know if at a glance that this is a string, not numeric data. So that's kind of good if you had two variables together that you didn't know if they were different types. So that's kind of cool. JSON decode. This could be JavaScript if not for the dollar signs. Error log. This outputs. This is a built-in function that outputs to the error log on the server. There's a log, kind of like the console log, but there's a text file that gets updated on the server. The thing of note here is this is calling a method on the message data object. Okay, but rather than have a dot here, partly because we use the dot for this, we use this arrow operator. Okay, so different languages have different syntax. They parse the syntax, and so there's different rules, but you kind of pick up on that stuff as you go. Debug it is actually just a call to error log with some additional testing, and I include that in Messenger. And so is scrub it. Scrub it is another thing that I'm calling. So scrub it doesn't have any error checking, but could. That's kind of the idea here. So I'm theoretically sanitizing the data here. Okay. So it looks like I'm doing a lot of things here. Really not. If you take the error messages out and the sanitizing, I'm really not doing anything here. I'm just grabbing the message data. Okay, I have the raw message data, and I could just skip all the way down here and just build the SQL query with these message data, message recipient. I could just take those and throw those in here directly. Okay, so I have the message text, the message recipient, and the message sender. Okay, so that's ultimately what I'm getting here. Okay, the sender, the recipient, the text, the things we sent. Okay, so we sent those three things, and those are the things I'm getting. Okay, so anybody lost so far? I used a lot of words to explain something really simple. Just tried to explain like how we got there to here. Okay, so we called this web URL, passed some stuff, and then we're kind of dealing with it now. Okay. All right, so now we are building an SQL query. So an SQL query, and you can read till your eyes bleed at mysql.com. They have extensive documentation there too. So MySQL is I think I mentioned the other day, uses the structured query language. Yeah, I think that's what it stands for. Anyway, there are multiple SQL variants. They're similar but different. Oracle has one. There's Postgres. There's Microsoft SQL. Most of them have things like select ID from users where, uses that sort of semi-English syntax to pull things from a database. Okay, so it was meant to allow business users to be able to pull data from a database using sort of English style syntax. Okay, so if we look at I'm going to pull back my PDF here again. So what I want to do is I want to select the ID from users. Okay, and I call this users, not user. So I had to fix that in my code. I should have fixed that on my image here. So this is called users. I should get you a new PDF with these things fixed. I noticed there were another errors here too. So we're going to select the ID from users where username, we're creating this string. Looks really complicated, but once you get out of all the escaped quotes and everything, so we're building something that looks like this. Okay, so select ID from users. Actually, where should be capitalized. It doesn't matter though. The capitalization is just for people. Oh, whoops. Okay, where, and then username equals, and then here I have a single quote before the double quote there, so we're going to put it in single quotes. The message sender, so it's going to be Elliot, and then it's in the single quotes here, so I have a single quote here, and then space limit 1, okay, and then a semicolon in here, okay. So that's our query. This is the query that gets sent to the database. Okay, so we're building this string, this sender SQL string, and then we're sending this query to the database. And in this case, we're fetching an associative array of IDs. Okay, so we're grabbing the items from the array. And there should just be one of them. Okay, so. Does that make sense to everybody? So basically, we're just translating the username to the number. This is a fancy way of doing that and this allows us to not know what the number is in our JavaScript at all. Okay, so the PHP does that translation. The PHP really doesn't need to know what the number is either. It asks the SQL database. Okay, so that's what this is. Actually, I probably should have always had this in the comments. Okay. And then the same thing for the message recipient. Okay. So we're setting the recipient ID and the sender ID, and that's how we're figuring it out. And then I'm outputting that to the log just so we have that. Okay. And then all we're doing, so all of this work was done, and it's not that much work. We're still at like 30 some lines of code, but we are including some additional code that I'll loop back to. But that stuff is just kind of cookie cutter stuff. So then finally, we're inserting into messages and here I'll pull this out too. So insert into messages. So we're inserting into the messages table I should make these regular quotes. I copied and pasted this. When it exports this stuff, it always makes them like the backtick symbol because I think it'll accept either one, and there's fewer chances for conflict with that. Either one will work for SQL. I think the regular quotes make more sense for most people. So we're gonna send the sender ID, the recipient ID, and the text. And I call it text instead of message. That's the other change that was in the PDF. Here I called it message. It's called text in the actual database. So we have all these other fields. The thing is, we don't have to fill these in. Okay, ID is generated automatically by the database. It will auto increment. So if we add a new message, if the last new message was 9, the next message will be 10. It will automatically create a new ID for us. The time, it's going to fill in with the current time automatically. And then this image URL, if we don't give it one, it's going to be blank. So we can just fill in the things we know. Okay. So and then we're going to pass it the values. So we're saying these are the things we're going to fill in, and then we fill in the actual values. So okay, if we run out of time, feel free to hit me up, set up a time offline about the CyberDuck thing. Otherwise, we can do that Tuesday. Okay, so this is what that looks like. And actually, we'll split this into 2 lines, which is totally fine. Okay. Okay, so this is what this looks like. Okay, so we're just building up this query, and we're just sending this. We don't care about the results. We might care if there's an error, and you may want to grab if there's an error and provide that as feedback to your JavaScript. I'll let you do that sort of thing. So you could provide some feedback to your JavaScript and display some kind of an error message. But we don't have to do that here. Um, this is a case where if we send the message and it doesn't get there, it doesn't get there. If the server's broken, it's broken. You could test that in your JavaScript to see if it actually sent. There's some ways to do that. So that is send message. Pretty straightforward. Other than so we're gonna look at messenger.php now. So that's included here. Messenger.php. Oh, look at this! It has another dependency. Where we're including credentials.php. Okay, so we have another dependency that we're gonna follow too. There's a reason for that, and I'll get into that. So this just includes two functions: scrub it, which takes an item and returns the item. It does nothing. That's just because you could put some additional validation code in here. Don't trust users. Okay, so that is potentially something you could do for your project, is add some validation code. You probably should. Because I'm not going to see your PHP code, you're going to want to call that out to me somehow if you want me to look that over. Okay, so that is something that you could do. You probably should do. I probably should have put some in there, but I wanted to leave you. This is an opportunity for you to try some PHP if you want to. You don't have to though. Up to you. Okay, and then debug it. I'm doing a bunch of tests to see if this flag exists. So I'm using this. This is a Boolean value. I'm testing this debug on global variable to see if it's true. If it is, then log the item that is passed here. If logging is on, then log this item. Okay, so when I'm calling these things in send message, debug it. If logging is on, which it is in here, if it's on, then send these to the log. If I turn this to false, none of these debug it messages will go, but the error log message still will. Okay. So, and you could change those as you see fit. Okay. So that is that. And then finally, we actually do the SQL connection by calling this function here, which we use the new operator, so it creates a new SQL object, and then we call methods on the object that you saw before. So like connection, and this is a method on the object, the connection object, connect error. Okay, so we set up this connection in this file. Okay, because that happens we set up the connection whether we're in send message or in get messages. Okay, so all this stuff is the same. So there's no reason to duplicate it in both files. So I wanted to abstract that out and make it a little bit simpler. Then credentials is abstracted even further because I'm using that in the installer.php as well. Okay, so these are just some variables that hold the information for the database. So SQL databases have names. So we're using the messenger database. So your SQL database is a collection of different databases. You can think about those as being files or directories of files, whatever metaphor you want to use. I like to think about of those as being files, and then inside the file, like if you think about Excel, then inside that Excel file, you have multiple sheets inside, and those sheets are the tables. So the database is messenger. That's our Excel file, so to speak. The host is localhost. That's the server. The server that you're on is called localhost. If you're just using the local server that the web server's on. If we had this on another server, we could list that here. So if your infrastructure got more complex, you could do that. And then we have, for security, we don't just let anybody access this stuff. We set up some permissions. So we have a user that has access to Messenger, calling it message user, and then we give it a password. Okay. And we're all using the same username and password. Obviously, that's not a great idea. If you want to change your stuff, you totally can, but just understand that you're changing it and understand the ramifications of that. Okay. So those are those dependencies. Let's look at get messages. That should go pretty quick now because it's pretty similar. So again, it relies on Messenger, which relies on credentials. Debug is on. now because uh, we're going to actually send some JSON, we're going to create an object in here. Okay, so we're going to create an array of messages. So we're going to emulate what the object syntax that we are using in the JavaScript. So our ID, time, sender rate. So these are all the things that are in our database. So this is just running some tests and returning things, and if they're not zero and all that. So if things are set, basically just making sure we have, we don't have like empty values. Okay. So messages, we're setting up an array. So this is where we're calling get val. Okay, get val for sender, and sender is a request field. So the requests are when we do post values. Remember, we sent sender, recipient, and newest message. Those are the values we sent. We have to pull those out. So we want to make sure they exist. Okay, so is set the request field, and if it is, scrub the value, and then debug it if we want it debugging on, and then return it. Otherwise, return 0. Okay, so we're getting those values for sender, recipient, and newest message. And then here, if the user, this is kind of a complicated looking query. It's not. It's basically saying add the user for the sender if the sender doesn't exist. So super insecure, you'd never do this. But if the sender, the person who's logged in, if they don't exist, just add them. If they do exist, don't do anything. Okay. I mean, on here it's saying on duplicate key update username equal username, so it's kind of updating. That's probably not the ideal, but basically we're just saying if it doesn't exist, add it. Okay, so it makes it really user friendly, but really a terrible security idea. So you can just add a user, and then you can send messages with those new users. You don't have to do anything special to add a user. This is some functionality that you could definitely make more secure. That is a feature you could definitely tackle. And then we do the same thing for the sender. Okay, so this security model is very flawed. And then we want to grab the recipient ID and the sender ID that we just created, if those are if they're new. Okay, so that's the main thing. We want to create those if they're new, and otherwise we want to grab the one that already exists. Okay. And then finally we want to grab the messages, and this is where we do a complex SQL query. So we're actually doing a what's called a join, a left join. So we're combining both of our tables together. Okay. So this is the magic of a relational database. It allows you to combine the two tables so that you don't have to do multiple queries with multiple tables and store in temporary variables. You can just merge these two things. It's like a mail merge sort of situation, and just output all the data at once. It's very cool. Okay. So what we're doing is we want to grab the messages ID. We want the messages time. We want the recipient's ID. Okay. But we also want the sender ID, the images URL, the messages text, but we also want the users.username. Okay. So these are all about the user that's pulling the we want the actual usernames to be used, right? So the JavaScript doesn't know about these numbers at all. So we need these usernames to be able to be used. Okay. So what we need to send back is the usernames. So what we want to pull out is actually the usernames. So we're doing this complex query so that we can get out the time, the ID, the usernames, the messages text, and if we were going to use it, the image URL. Okay. So in order to get at the username, we have to link these two tables together, and we join them on where the sender ID equals the user ID, or where the sender ID equals the sender ID, or the sender ID equals the recipient ID. So we're grabbing messages where either the sender sent it or the recipient sent it, basically. Okay, where those IDs match. Okay, and then the message sent recipient is the opposite. Okay. So without being too complicated, it makes kind of a complicated looking thing, but we want to grab all the messages that that you and I sent to each other, either direction. We want to grab all of those so we can send those back to the JavaScript. Okay, so that's what this does. It's a kind of a complicated looking thing, but we're able to get it all into one spreadsheet and shoot it back to the JavaScript in a format that we care about. Okay, so then we're grabbing that array, and then we're adding it to our message. Okay, so we're creating a new message, and we're scrubbing it, and we're shooting it out. Okay, we're adding it to messages. So creating a new message, we're adding it to messages, and then when we're all done, we just JSON encode it and shoot it up to the JavaScript. Okay, so we're adding the ID, the time, the sender ID, the username, the recipient ID. We're sending these along, but the JavaScript doesn't even care. So we could simplify it and not even send those things. But if you want those things, you can use them. Okay. So I think that is all that. So then the final thing is the installer. Okay. So what you might be asking is, how the heck did those tables get created? There are some tables created on your server, but we're actually going to make some changes. So because I had to make some changes, I had to give you a way to do that. So I made this little installer.php, and I will give a video that just step-by-step, a separate video that steps you through how to do this. So don't get too bent out of shape on this. So it's just PHP. It pulls in credentials, but not Messenger. Okay, so it pulls in those credentials by themselves. But we have some different credentials, the root credentials, because we're going to create these credentials on the SQL server. So we're going to make these work, so the other scripts work, the other programs work. And I have a global variable called allGood equals true. And then I have a function called doInstallTask. If it's successful, say it's successful. If it failed, say it failed. Interesting. Okay. I don't think I need this here. I don't think I use this. Anyway, I made some changes as I was going. I didn't pull everything out. So step by step, if you want to see how you can create your own. So if you wanted to add fields, for instance, you could make changes in here and rerun this, and it will delete the existing users and databases and passwords, and it will recreate the tables. So this is what the messages table looks like if you want to create the table. So the ID is an auto increment field. It can have up to 255 characters, 255 long character, 255 digit long integer, I should say. Time is a timestamp. Sender ID is 255 long. Integer recipient ID is 255. Image URL is 255. Text is just a text field. Those are really long. Messengers, same kind of thing. The usernames are limited to 16 characters for no particularly good reason. That could be changed. And then if nothing fails, I have this all good flag that gets flipped if anything goes bad. And if it's all good, it says all good. If it's not good, then in red it says installation failed. Check what's up. Okay. So, in a nutshell, whenever I want to wipe everything out, I can just go back to here. So if I refresh and I hit connect, this will pull up all the messages. If I want to wipe everything out, I can just go installer.php and it'll wipe those out. And if I go back to my messenger, hit connect, there are no messages because I wiped everything out. So, but I'll give you another video on those. So that is everything. Super quick. Skipped a bunch of things. Any questions? Sorry it went long and boring. Liar. All lies. Or you don't care. Maybe you don't care. Is this stuff interesting at all? Is it valuable to know this stuff? PHP is one of the top 5 programming languages yet, so I think having some exposure to PHP is valuable. So even if you don't like it, which is totally valid, you can't have an opinion. You're not allowed by me to have an opinion unless you have some exposure to it. Just like you're not allowed to hate Mac or Windows without knowing both of them. Cool. So I'm going to stop this. I will get the video from yesterday.